Spanning more than 2 decades and multiple developers, the Tomb Raider series serves almost as a barometer of progress in the space of 3D real-time graphics, from its first outing in 1996 and its various improvements up through the turn of the millennium, to its most ambitious stumbling and subsequent resurrection the following decade, to its most complete makeover in 2013. The series has evolved and changed to meet the needs of each new era. And now Lara Croft has emerged once more with Shadow of the Tomb Raider, a new adventure in the mold of the previous 2 games from Crystal Dynamics. But this is not your typical sequel. Today then, we're going to explore the reasons why, including how the game has changed since previous installments, what improvements can one expect coming from Rise of the Tomb Raider, and in what ways has the developer utilized the strengths of each console. We'll answer all those questions and more, starting right now. So, let's begin. Shadow of the Tomb Raider is a direct follow-up to Rise of the Tomb Raider by design, but not by lineage. For the first time, a direct sequel to a previous game has been handled primarily by another development team, in this case, Eidos Montreal. That's right, the studio behind the recent and excellent Deus Ex titles has taken the helm this time, delivering a game that feels decidedly different in tone while still maintaining what made the previous entries great. Crystal Dynamics is still involved as a support studio, mind you, but this is effectively an Eidos Montreal game. Crucially, this new development team has a lot of experience in engine development, having crafted the Dawn engine for use in Deus Ex Mankind Divided. It was a great match for this type of first-person experience, but with Tomb Raider, it didn't really make sense to reinvent the wheel. Thus, Shadow of the Tomb Raider instead utilizes Crystal Dynamics' own Foundation engine, only this time with some new Montreal-developed augmentations. Essentially, during the development of this new game, Eidos Montreal has implemented a wide range of enhancements and features, pushing the Foundation engine to the next level, while overcoming some of the weaknesses inherent in the previous game. It starts with image quality. Rise of the Tomb Raider is a beautiful game, of course, but its basic post-process anti-aliasing could result in noticeable shimmering, especially in foliage-heavy scenes like this. With Shadow of the Tomb Raider spending most of its runtime within a dense forest area, this wouldn't fly. Thus, the team implemented a new temporal anti-aliasing technique designed to clean up and eliminate shimmering across the game. These thick jungle environments hold up beautifully thanks to this new technique. Speaking of jungles, I've noticed a theme in the series in this regard that continues with Shadow of the Tomb Raider. What I mean is, the third installment in each specific run of Tomb Raider games seems to focus heavily on dense jungle environments, and personally my theory is that this is tangentially related to the technology powering the games. Take the core design originals. Tomb Raider 1 and 2, they're generally focused on areas where drawing foliage and trees wasn't really necessary. After all, this was a very difficult thing to pull off in the original PlayStation. By the time the team reached the third game, however, the first environment you visit is in fact a thick jungle. Now, at this point, the engine had evolved, supporting a higher resolution of 512 by 240 and larger, more detailed maps with increased polygon counts and, you guessed it, foliage. This type of environment wouldn't have been possible in prior games, I'd imagine. This also holds true once Crystal Dynamics took over the franchise. Tomb Raider Legend and Anniversary are both visually impressive for their day, but Tomb Raider Underworld was the first to be developed for the then next-generation Xbox 360. Their engine evolved to support the more powerful machine, enabling more complex environments, including, of course, a thick jungle environment, and it was gorgeous. And now, once again, we're seeing this same trend continue. While the Foundation engine could almost certainly have supported this type of environment previously, the changes made since Rise of the Tomb Raider better support this sort of world. A jungle environment likely wouldn't have looked quite this nice 3 or 4 years ago. And one of the key advancements involves the interaction of light and foliage. Essentially, plants are now properly transmissive, meaning light passes realistically through the leaves, while also exhibiting a natural waxiness and specular sheen. This is all extremely evident throughout the many jungle sequences you'll encounter throughout the game. And beyond that, the density of this foliage is also a huge step up from previous games in the series. The gently blowing plants and trees greatly improve the general atmosphere. Shadow of the Tomb Raider also relies heavily on volumetric fog effects. This thick haze regularly floods across the scene, giving the impression of light scattering through the air. It's a great implementation, but the most effective usage stems from these smoke canisters which Lara can toss to hide from enemies. As you can see in this sequence, a fog volume is spawned along with the smoke particles, which causes light sources such as torches to appear hazy when peering through the smoke. It's an impressive technique indeed. Then of course there's texture detail. Shadow of the Tomb Raider relies heavily on parallax occlusion maps, along with high-resolution textures designed to convey a sensation of realistic material. This is also true of Rise of the Tomb Raider, of course, but I feel that the material quality has improved significantly with this game. The mix of stonework on ancient temples and things like this mud here look really excellent. The mud itself is also worth talking about. Beyond the quality of the surface material, there's pools of mud like this, which are more interactive. Utilizing the deformation technique featured in the previous game, and used for snow, Shadow of the Tomb Raider improves upon this by simulating water running into the mud trails as you walk through them. Procedural mud textures are also used on Lara's model, and sometimes this even doubles as a game mechanic. Another neat trick involves the leaves strewn across the ground. Rather than simply using a flat texture, these are rendered using parallax occlusion maps, like many other surfaces in the game. It's an effective technique that adds a lot of depth to the jungle floor. It looks really nice. Water is another area that is improved. Utilizing stochastic screen space reflections this time, there's a greater variation in reflection roughness and detail based on the surface of the water. Reflections no longer appear as a perfect mirror of the surroundings, instead more closely matching the properties of the water itself. This is coupled with some excellent cube map work layered beneath the SSR. The water surface also receives a nice shader technique designed to simulate ripples as Lara swims through it. Notice that ripples are not only created from her torso, but from the motion of her arms as well. Below the surface, a texture is used to simulate water caustics along the river floor, and the animation of the texture seems to drive the movement of the volumetric light filtering through the surface of the water. These details are just a few examples of the areas where the game has improved since Rise of the Tomb Raider, but beyond the technology, the art direction itself also varies significantly. In line with its title, Shadow of the Tomb Raider is generally a darker game, relying more heavily on, well, shadowed regions. It's a more subdued presentation, and one that I feel is genuinely a step up from the previous game. Everything is simply more nuanced and richly lit and shadowed. Shadows are high resolution but still naturally soft, and the solution for global illumination, while likely the same as the previous game, is more aesthetically pleasing overall and less harsh. And issues like lower precision specular lighting evident in Rise of the Tomb Raider have been mostly avoided here. Basically, it feels like a nice evolution all around, even though it isn't necessarily a generational shift. Which brings us to our first console comparison: resolution differences. While Rise of the Tomb Raider launched first on Xbox before coming to other platforms, Shadow of the Tomb Raider is instead releasing simultaneously across all of them. Of course, our PC correspondent Alex will tackle that version later this week, but for now, we're focusing on the main console versions, which leaves us with Xbox One, Xbox One X, PlayStation 4, and the Pro. So let's start with the lowest resolution of the bunch, the Xbox One S. As a reminder, Rise of the Tomb Raider manages to deliver a full 1080p on the Xbox One during gameplay, while operating at 1440 by 1080 during cutscenes. This time around, however, with more complex visuals, the resolution has been dropped to 1600 by 900 instead. Thanks to the excellent temporal anti-aliasing solution, however, this isn't really something to worry about. Image quality is improved over the original game thanks to this new technique. It is a touch softer, of course, as you'd expect, but it's preferable overall. Then we come to the PlayStation 4 version, which delivers 1080p, just like Rise of the Tomb Raider, and again, thanks to the TAA, it looks very smooth and slightly sharper than Xbox One S. So that's good news for base console owners, right? Next up are the higher end consoles, and this is where things get a little more interesting. Both PS4 Pro and Xbox One X include a high resolution and high frame rate mode. When using the high frame rate mode, performance is greatly increased at the expense of resolution. where both platforms are dropped to a native 1080p. It looks visually identical to the base PS4 version as a result, but it can be worth looking at when searching for that extra fluidity. The high-resolution modes, however, are a little different. Let's consider Rise of the Tomb Raider again. On PlayStation 4 Pro, the maximum resolution used checkerboard rendering to reach a 2160p pixel count, while Xbox One delivers instead a true native 4K. With Shadow of the Tomb Raider, we're instead looking at a slight drop in resolution. On the Pro, we counted 1872p across a huge range of shots. Of course, do keep in mind that there is a possibility of dynamic resolution in play here, but 1872p came up over and over again in our counts, suggesting that if it is dynamic, it does not drop often. But there's more. The PS4 Pro also employs checkerboard rendering. It's fairly effective overall, but you'll notice some artifacts when the frame is abruptly changed. Now, Xbox One X in comparison does not employ any form of checkerboard rendering. Instead, the game targets a very near 4K resolution, 2016p to be precise. Thanks to the strong temporal anti-aliasing, however, it looks effectively native 4K when viewed from a normal distance, but there is a touch of softness there if you look closely. In certain instances, there is also evidence of a dynamic resolution in play, but this does appear to be relatively uncommon. For all intents and purposes, this is a 2016p game on Xbox One X, and yes, it looks noticeably sharper than the PS4 Pro version. Now, beyond resolution, are there any other differences to consider here? Well, both the PS4 Pro and Xbox One X receive, as the developers call, 4K textures, which adds an additional layer of detail to things like Lara's clothing in this scene. This change is certainly far more subtle than what we saw in Rise of the Tomb Raider, but honestly, texture work is great across the board, and the higher resolution modes help bring out that extra detail in a big way. The consoles also seem to utilize 4x anisotropic filtering for those interested, which looks mostly solid in this game due to a distinct lack of flat surfaces. So overall then, this really isn't a game where you'll find noticeable differences in quality between the various console options. It does look better on the higher end consoles, of course, but honestly the experience is solid on all machines. And just for those curious, here's how the Xbox One X stands up against the Xbox One S. The original system certainly holds its own here, but yeah, the massive upgrade in resolution makes a huge difference overall. And the high frame rate mode is certainly closer in terms of image quality, but the benefit of faster performance is plainly visible. It's just a shame then that the enriched mode featured in the previous title, which could render at a higher resolution using checkerboard rendering while pushing out details more to the PC level, has been eliminated this time around. And how about the two PlayStation consoles? Again, nothing too terribly exciting here, it's mainly down to resolution or frame rate. We've already seen how the Pro stacks up against the Xbox One X, of course, and yeah, the extra resolution on the X does give it a nice advantage. So what other details are shared between the different systems then? Returning from Rise of the Tomb Raider is the hair simulation. It's not assigned a name this time around as far as I can tell, but it's basically Tress effects. Hair can appear a tad noisy at lower resolutions, of course, and it does tend to clip through other objects, but the overall effect is convincing enough. Character rendering and cutscene quality is also top-notch. Everyone has a slightly different appearance than before, curiously enough, but the facial expressions and cinematic animation is of great quality, plus the hexagon-shaped bokeh depth of field is simply gorgeous in action. Cutscenes were a high point in Rise of the Tomb Raider, and that remains the case here. Well, for the most part, while major scenes are beautifully animated, secondary characters aren't quite given the same attention to detail, and basic conversations like this are fraught with limited movement and dead eyes galore. It's not great, and it kind of feels out of place against the otherwise beautiful cinematic sequences. There's also less in the way of pre-rendered disaster-type sequences. Okay, if you recall, Rise of the Tomb Raider features scenes like this, which are basically a mix of real-time 3D elements with these pre-rendered effects layered on top. This may still exist in Shadow of the Tomb Raider, of course, but after playing a good bit of the way through the game, I haven't run across anything quite like it. That's not to say there isn't some impressive sequences in the game, of course. Take a look at this. As for gameplay animation, the team has done a good job overall. Most of Lara's moves smoothly transition between and combine with one another thanks to the animation layering system first devised for Rise of the Tomb Raider. While it generally looks good, there are instances where the transitions aren't quite as smooth as I would have liked, so it can be hit or miss. At least the per pixel motion blur has returned in full force and looks phenomenal here without being overly distracting for those that don't like it. Though unlike another recent game, you can't disable it in the menu if you don't. It does look rather impressive when playing with the game's high frame rate mode, however, especially during cutscenes. This effect lends these sequences an almost pre-rendered look at times. Now at this point, we should probably stop and discuss one of the most significant differences between all of the different versions, and that's performance. On each platform throughout the run of play, we're looking at a reasonably steady frame rate, but not one without issues. So let's kick off with the base consoles. While playing on the Xbox One S, the game is capped at 30 frames per second, while utilizing an adaptive VSync solution, just like Rise of the Tomb Raider. Despite the drop in resolution, however, performance is not quite as stable as I would have liked. Sections like this early jungle area exhibit minor dips and torn frames while exploring the area. For the second test, I opted for this early escape sequence. With all the chaos ensuing around the player, it's a good test for the system in a high-intensity situation, and the Xbox One S does a reasonably good job of holding on to its 30 FPS target throughout most of the scene. There are situations again which cause the performance to dip and tear, but it's not too severe. Still, when you couple the lower resolution with slightly unstable performance, it does feel a tad less polished overall compared to the previous game. Base PlayStation 4 owners fare a touch better overall then. Resolution is bumped up to 1080p and the average frame rate seems to hold closer to 30 frames per second. This same jungle area runs reasonably well most of the time, but jumping into the water and swimming around can trigger issues like this. Same goes for the flood sequence, which holds 30 most of the time as well, but does highlight one odd issue I noticed across all versions of the game. Frame time pauses between certain camera cuts, evident as dips here on the graph. A minor complaint, sure, but it's something to note. Also, unlike the Xbox, the PS4 version uses a triple buffer VSync setup, meaning no tearing. On average then, I'd say the base consoles manage to hit their target most of the time, but heavier sequences can drop performance a touch, more so on the base Xbox One. Neither version runs quite as well as Rise of the Tomb Raider though. But as with the resolution, things get more interesting when we shift over to the Pro and Xbox One X. So let's start with the high frame rate mode, which is supported by both platforms. On the PlayStation 4 Pro, the game uses vertical sync like the base system, so you do avoid tearing, but the game doesn't really manage to hold on to its 60 FPS target all that well. Simplistic scenes can deliver this, but when the action ramps up or the scenery becomes more complex, the frame rate drops below 60 frames per second and hangs there. You can see that here in this early jungle section of the game, which turns in an average frame rate of roughly 51 frames per second. This flood sequence then struggles even more with regular drops under the target. It just winds up feeling rather inconsistent during play, and I wouldn't really recommend the high frame rate mode on the Pro unless you really don't mind judder. This is fairly consistent with Rise of the Tomb Raider's PS4 Pro patch, by the way, though perhaps just a tad slower overall. Xbox One X, on the other hand, turns in much better performance all around, but it's not perfect either. That same jungle area exhibits plenty of torn frames, but averages around 56 frames per second versus the Pro at 51. I found that most small to moderately sized areas came close to holding 60 FPS on the X, with only the larger zones and combat areas really struggling to get there. The flood sequence is a good example of this. With just a few minor hiccups here and there, the entire scene is pretty much a locked 60 FPS on the X, while the Pro version regularly drops below 60 FPS. It's an impressive showing for sure on the Xbox, and it makes for an interesting comparison since Pro and X are effectively running the same exact settings here when high frame rate mode is selected, so it's a real test of what the two systems can do. But what about the high resolution mode? Well, this is perhaps where the tables turn a little bit. The Pro version holds 30 frames per second in nearly every major scene I tested. It is still possible to trigger minor drops like this, but overall, it's a very stable 30 frames per second. In fact, it's smoother than any other version we've looked at so far in terms of consistency. I feel that if you're on the Pro, this is definitely the mode to use due to that extra consistency. And that's consistent with this flood sequence as well. It is also a stable 30 FPS throughout, aside from those tiny frame time dips that occur during scene flips. Now the Xbox One X also manages to deliver 30 frames per second in most scenes, but I did notice additional dips and tears in areas like this more often than on the Pro. It's stable enough not to become a problem, I'd say, but it's definitely something you will notice. The issue is more apparent in scenes like this, however. The same flood sequence appears to struggle to hold 30 FPS on the X, with plenty of screen tearing and judder as a result. Since this is basically a locked 60 FPS in the high frame rate mode, it does suggest that the GPU is simply bottlenecked here. Perhaps a more aggressive dynamic resolution option would solve the issue. Still, even with these minor drops, I have to give the overall nod to the Xbox One X here. While the minor tearing is annoying when it occurs in the 4K mode, the extra sharpness is noticeable, and if you prefer a faster frame rate, the X version excels there as well. That's not to say that the Pro version is a slouch, mind you. In fact, it's great, as are all versions. It's just that, if you have the choice, you gotta go with Xbox One X here. I should also mention briefly the HDR implementation. Supported across all consoles which offer HDR support, Shadow of the Tomb Raider just happens to be one of the best examples of HDR in games that I've seen to date. Right up there with the likes of Gran Turismo Sport, in fact. It's not evident in this video, of course, since it's not an HDR video, but if you have a capable display, it's truly a remarkable showing, and it has a full suite of adjustments available so you can tweak it to match your TV's capabilities. One last issue I wanted to mention here is input latency. I don't have any hard numbers handy, but I did find the game to be significantly less responsive than I'd like. In fact, it feels very much like Rise of the Tomb Raider at launch, or something like Killzone 2. The controls just feel heavy. It's one of the most disappointing elements with the game, honestly, and hopefully it can be corrected, as it was with Rise. Which brings us to my wrap-up thoughts on the game itself. I've enjoyed the previous two games, and now Shadow as well, but there is a noticeable difference in terms of pacing and flow. Essentially, Shadow is a game that is much heavier on puzzle solving and less focused on combat. There's still plenty of action and stealth here, of course, but it's no longer the primary focus. The puzzles themselves are often quite enjoyable to solve with some complex mechanisms in play. It's familiar territory for the series, of course, but it feels more elaborate this time out. The combat and stealth that is in the game, though, still works nicely most of the time, though some of the faster enemies can prove a little annoying in close combat scenarios. Basically, this does share many elements with previous titles, but it has its own pacing and focus. It feels like a unique experience. So where do they go from here? Well, at this point, I'd kinda like to see the series enter yet another iteration, something that harkens back to the originals. Since Crystal Dynamics took over the series, Tomb Raider has lost that sense of danger that you felt in the core design originals. Climbing a large structure in the earliest games was not an easy task. Patience and mastery of the controls was required. Now, I'm not saying we go back to tank controls, mind you, but there has to be some way to bring that sensation back. The modern games simply feel too automated in comparison. That said, what is here is still excellent, and the platforming is really used more as an element in puzzle solving than as a challenge in and of itself, so it works. Still, in the end, Shadow of the Tomb Raider is both a great game and a great looking one. It's definitely worth a look, especially if you're a fan of the series. That is all for now though. If you enjoyed this video, as always, be sure to like, subscribe, ring the bell, and follow us over on Twitter. And until next time, this is John signing off.